Okay, I think it's time to start. When more people will be joining, we will be letting them in. So, first of all, hello everyone. My name is Mariusz Kowalski. I'm Deputy Chair of the board of the MBA Alumni Association with the Polish Academy of Sciences. Welcome to our webinar with Global Upside CEO and founder, Ragu Bhargava. So today we will be discussing the current M&A environment, key industries and countries, and tips for executing successful global mergers and acquisitions, as well as where and how to expand during the COVID times. Please feel free to submit your questions through the chat, so we will be answering them accordingly. And well, thank you for joining us, Ragu. We really appreciate it, not least that it's 6:30 your time in the morning. So good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. So why don't you start by giving us a little bit of background on your organization?
Maurice, first of all, let me thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak in front of this crowd. And yes, it is a little early, but I'm an early bird, so no big deal. I've been up for a few hours. Talking about Global Upside, we've been in business for over 20 years, assisting companies with their global expansion needs. We specialize in providing services that you need whenever, wherever you need them in over 160 countries today. From hire to retire and record to report, Global Upside solves complexity and supports businesses at every stage of growth across the globe. And let me turn it back to you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you for this. And well, why don't we start with a sort of more general question? So how would you describe the current global M&A environment? Where are we?
Yeah, it's a very interesting environment because obviously pandemic is presenting lots and lots of challenges in the M&A arena. Starting all the way from due diligence. And due diligence used to be you would go visit the target's facilities, you would go shake hands, look at documents, and do all of that. And right now in the current environment, obviously travel is limited. Sometimes you can't get a visa. If you can get a visa, you can't go to the country. You go to the country, you're quarantined. So there are lots of challenges in the due diligence phase itself. What we're seeing is post due diligence or post the acquisition is TSA, day zero TSAs. TSA is the Transition Services Agreement. And what we're seeing with them over the last 2-3 years is they're getting shorter and shorter. Now they're almost a very customary 0-day TSAs. So how do you stand up the targets, employees, their facilities and everything on day one? And that is a real challenge because procuring some of these resources that you need to support the teams is very hard. Focusing on the people aspect of an M&A, think about putting all kinds of benefit plans in place and doing payroll. Depending on the timing of the acquisition, payroll may have a few days to a few weeks. Benefits are very hard to procure. Plus, keep in mind that if you're buying a division of a large company, what you have now is a smaller population. And with smaller populations, brokers are more reluctant to work, which means that you have a much more harder time procuring these benefits. Portfolio consolidation is an important issue because what you want is a good visibility as a private equity firm or as an investor. And so if you have multiple countries and multiple geographies for your target, you need to think about how do you bring it all together. So global systems, global service providers, shared service centers, those are becoming more and more important. And those are some of the factors to consider from an M&A targeting perspective, due diligence perspective.
Okay, but then if we could also compare, because you know, I would imagine that the global M&A, an international one, will differ from a transaction performed within a single country. Uh, so how does this processes differ one from each other, not least today?
Yeah, so if you're doing an acquisition where the target is based only in one country, it's like I was talking about earlier, travel is in some respects a non-issue, and especially depending on the country. So there's countries like US, China, Canada, very large countries. Traveling across the country isn't something you can get in the car and do. But if you're in a smaller country, you might be able to do that. You may still be able to go visit the facilities. You may still be able to go meet the people and stuff. And so that is still a factor. But in cross-border transactions, what happens is um, the challenge of onboarding employees is very, very different, because in the domestic transaction or one country transaction, you have the ability to quickly scale up because you are in just one geography and you can focus on that, and you may actually have a lot of expertise in-house because that is your home country. So you are from Poland, you're acquiring another company in Poland, you know all the rules and regulations. But now imagine going to UK or China or India or Philippines. To bring all of those teams together in multi-country transactions, what happens is you have 20 countries and you have 20 different sets of rules that you have to deal with. And if you do not have the right service providers, you may actually have 20 service providers along every line of support that you need. So benefits, employment law, payroll, um, how do you procure and onboard these people? And the rules are different. You may actually need lawyers to negotiate with the unions or collective bargaining agreements applicable. Countries like France have the Works Council that you have to deal with. And so it complicates the matters even more as you cross borders, and makes it much, much harder to do this. Now, obviously, some of the factors that can play in your favor is, again, having a global service provider, having a provider that has done this before, having a provider that knows the rules of the countries you're going into to do the acquisition. Because then what you can do is, from a centralized location, you can manage all of that through these service providers. And also, these service providers might bring tools to the table that can help you monitor the performance, monitor what's going on, making sure that in a particular country where you may only have, say, one or two employees, they're not slipping through the cracks somehow because you're focused on the country with 100 employees or something like that. So those factors do come into play, and uh, and just keeping people informed through the whole process. Your service providers, the employees of the target, once you announce the deal, as to what the transition plan is. And now this obviously does not, I'm not talked about RIFs or reductions in force post acquisition, because the reduction in force might actually have even significant um, cost and time requirement, only because today, when countries, governments are trying to maintain employment, and so if you're trying to do a reduction in force, that might not be pursued very well. But you might be able to offset some of that cost of labor by some subsidies that you can get from the government. And it may not be one for one, but it can help offset some of those costs.
Well, considering that you are, you know, like a Polish company, considering expansion abroad, even in these days, I mean, what would be your advice? I mean, obviously, COVID-19, as you're saying, completely changed, affected the deal-making process. So what would be your sort of suggestions here? What would be things sort of to pay attention to?
Yeah, so some of the factors that, in particular, private equity firms are considering right now is why. Why are you doing this deal? What are the logistics, business logistics making sense or not making sense to do this deal? So you have to think about that first. And you have to think about that in all situations, but it has become more important. Uh, and because of that, you also have to worry about what happens to this company the day after your acquisition. So in the pandemic times, a lot of companies are losing revenue. Revenues are declining. And how do you justify buying a company at this level of valuation, this level of revenue, when there's a possibility that the revenues might decline to something less than that? How will you recoup your investment? Things like that. But strategic investments still make sense. Growth still makes sense because obviously that helps your own operations be bigger, better. Acquisition of talent or acquisition of facilities makes sense because if you're short on talent, you may walk into a competitor um, or a complementary company, procure them, and that would help you enhance your resources. Similarly, what is the hottest selling items right now, and how long will that continue? That trend continue, and can you acquire a company that you can leverage to manufacture more of those goods? Now, a lot of countries are transitioning from sort of the manufacturing-based manufacturing environment focus to, say, a technology focus or a service focus, which as you migrate, the old manufacturing companies might want to look at other countries where they can acquire companies or manufacturing facilities. That would make sense because then they can migrate and migrate their facility, say, from Poland to Thailand or Philippines, or maybe procure in your neighboring countries, which is pretty a hotbed of high level of talent, procure a services company in your neighboring geographies that can benefit you from having more engineering talent, ability to speed up the development of your product. Those kind of things are relevant still in terms of looking at targets and why.
I think you raised a few really interesting points, and actually one of them is that, in the case of Poland, and for like 20 years or more, many businesses had this ambition of attracting, manufacturing, being like a hub for cheaper manufacturing for Western geographies. While nowadays, people realize that, you probably need to build your competitive advantage over innovation. So it is something that we do see in the Polish economy, and that's why I think we are discussing this sort of M&A transactions from this market's perspective. And speaking about that, I mean, which industries, which types of businesses are attracting the most private equity interest globally? What are the sort of hotspots?
Yeah, so historically, investments have always been made in, so to speak, recession-proof industries or businesses because their downside risk is much lower. Now, the pandemic has brought in a whole new visibility into the, as an example, online shopping. So places like Amazon are doing much more. Places like Walmart, I'm sorry, I'm using US examples here, like Walmart, walk-in stores are doing much less. Just people aren't going to the store anymore. Um, so what that is doing is changing where people are investing. Obviously, TMT or technology media is uh, very, very important because look at this. We are on a call and through Microsoft meetings, correct? Zoom has done extremely well. Anybody that has that technology is a hot company right now. Why? Because we have to evolve and find new ways of communications, new ways of talking to people across the world when we cannot travel or we cannot shake hands. So those things are very important. Additionally, think about the next step. We need to develop a vaccine. We need to take care of our sick. We need to save lives. So healthcare is very, very hot. And we're all obviously all hearing news about, vaccine companies, developments, how many millions of dollars, billions of dollars governments are pouring into it. So uh, depending on what healthcare sector you are in, that may be really hard. Obviously, the person that comes first to the market with a proven vaccine will have a huge advantage. Um, Manufacturing and cybersecurity still continue to be important. Cybersecurity even more so, because what is happening is as more and more time is spent online, uh, the activities around phishing, around hacking are increasing significantly. So there is as the unemployment rates have grown, the level of crime has grown. And crime, because you're staying at home, nobody can come and rob your home, but they can financially rob you through access to your computer, through access to your bank account, things like that. So cybersecurity has become very important. The one thing that has been developing for the past couple of decades, but has become extremely relevant in the pandemic times, is e-learning. So companies still need to train the people. They still need to get new hires on board and do all of that stuff that they would normally do in a brick and mortar pre-pandemic situation. Even more importantly, schools have always been that concept where, hey, my kid is going to get ready, go to school from 8 to 5, whatever, 8 to 3, be there and then come home. And school was always an in-person event. Right now, that is not the case. And schools are struggling with both hardware issues, access issues, and how do you teach? How do you conduct a lesson? How do you do all of that? So e-learning, as it relates to K through 12, is extremely important. As you get into college, the e-learning requirements are a little bit different. So you can do something over Zoom as an example, or Microsoft Meetings, or Google, other solutions. But some of these systems have limitations in terms of attendees. So those challenges still play into it and are important. So those are some of the industries that are pretty hot. We're seeing a lot of activity in.
Excellent. And so consider that, we would like to expand somewhere. We identify, an interesting target in one of the sectors you mentioned. So in your view, what would be sort of the most important sort of factors to consider for a successful acquisition, for a successful investment?
And some of these factors I've talked about, but um, keep in mind that location and footprint is important. Location being, where are the facilities, where are the people located uh, of the target, and how does it complement your personnel? So you may have no presence today in UK, but if you're buying a company that has a lot of people located in UK, that helps you establish in that country very easily. The minute you complete the acquisition, you have a set of people that can now do whatever your business needs to do, or the target's business continues to do. Similarly, the facilities, correct? So and I'm talking about manufacturing facilities, because obviously we're all working from home, other than the manufacturing environment, which people still go and work the machines and produce the goods. So the location of these factories is important. Why is that important? Because uh, we are seeing some challenges in the supply chain in terms of shipping goods cross country, across the world, and stuff. So if you have a good manufacturing base in Poland and you can cover, say, the neighboring countries, how about buying something in France, or how about buying something in Philippines? And then that will allow you another point of shipment, well, manufacturing and shipment, to that geography. Historically, you may have supplied the Asian market from Poland, but how do you do that when you cannot ship that easily and there are logistic challenges? So that location matters. The need to possibly resize the operations post acquisition. So yes, you have a good target in UK, they have 100 people, but you think you only need 50. So how does that matter? What are you going to have to do? And how do you do that in these pandemic times? How will the government of UK look at it? And maybe you can negotiate something with the government, some kind of a subsidy or something like that. Maybe you can negotiate something with the seller where they are actually going to do some of their layoff reduction in force the day before the acquisition closes. And there are other structures that are possible. A good advisor can help you with some of these things. But think about the size of the combined company post acquisition. It is important to think through that. Also, if you're a private equity firm, well, maybe you have excess capacity in this company that you're buying, but you need to build some capacity in a complementary or an adjacent industry in that manufacturing facility that may or may not be too far from the new target. So you might be able to move X number of people from the target into another portfolio company of yours. And in that respect, again, location matters, facilities matter, but do you have that ability? Now, having a portfolio of companies helps, but obviously, if you are just an individual investor or one single company, you may not have that ability to do that kind of transition. And then, think about your service providers. I cannot emphasize this enough. I've already brought it up a couple of times. Think about the advisors you're relying on to structure, not just structure financially and legally that deal, but also from an operational perspective. Like I said, you may know the rules of Poland, but do you know the rules of UK? You know that there are two pay rules that control the benefits, the employment, the compensation that has to match whatever the prior employer was providing. You can't just willy-nilly cut those and change those. And those processes sometimes can be hard and expensive. But knowing that in advance, then you're prepared for it. And you factor that into your decision making of the cost of the acquisition. Hope that helps.
No, absolutely. But I think these are important aspects to consider, and another one would be like setup options. So what would be the setup options when you sort of expand business to a new country? I mean, what would be the things to consider from your perspective?
Yeah, so one of the things to consider is back to the concept of the footprint, correct? How many people do you have in a particular country? So obviously, if you have tens of people or hundreds of people, you kind of have to have your own entity, whether it is coming as part of the acquisition or you're establishing a new one. But you have to have your own legal entity to employ these people and provide them benefits, payroll, run the back office of the company from a compliance and accounting perspective. As your headcount decreases, especially as it gets closer to the single digits, what happens is the cost of compliance, the cost of setting up an entity, running the whole operations can become very expensive. To just run a shell company in a foreign country can take anywhere from $20,000 to $50,000 a year, depending on the country. So think about having 5 people in a country, having to burden it with $50,000 a year of cost. So one of the options that has developed over the past few years, and we offer this solution also, is what is known as a PEO in the US, Professional Employment Organizations, or outside of the US, they are known as EOR, Employer of Record Solutions, where what you're doing is taking that small headcount and putting them on somebody else's payroll. And even though their pay stub would say the name of the PEO, even though that PEO is providing all the benefits and everything, the employees actually carry the card, the email address, they represent the client, the buyer in this situation. So what you're doing is you are offloading the cost of compliance, you're offloading the cost of HR, the payroll, all of that to a third party, and you're still getting the full advantage of that team. Now, it doesn't relieve you of the burden of having to worry about severance or termination cost if it comes down to that. And depending on which PEO you engage with, you may actually have to worry about how do you transition as your business continues to grow in a particular country where you had a PEO solution in place, and now your headcount is twice as much or three times as much, and you want to bring it all in-house. You need to evaluate how to do that properly. And depending on that, a PEO is a great solution in many times, even on a short-term basis, where you know that you cannot set up your infrastructure to employ these people. So even though the headcount might be a little bit higher, what you do is you bring them on a PEO, and then as you set up your infrastructure, which can take anywhere from a month to 6 months, then you migrate them back to your entities. And this way, the employees have a good HR experience, good payroll experience, and it mitigates your risk that somebody says, hey, I'm not getting paid, so I'm going to leave. And obviously the highest quality of talent leaves first, which is the people that you do not want to leave. So. Maurice? Maurice? Hello? Maurice, did we lose you, or are you on mute, or?
No, I think just something happened. So,
Okay.
but I'm back. I'm back.
Okay.
So it was just sort of some technical issue, I think, on my end. So just to sort of wrap up, because I was just disconnected. I mean, you talked a little bit about the PEO advantages, right?
Yeah.
And I think it touches upon something which is quite interesting and I think important, namely, you have, as an expanding company, probably at some point you need to consider what to focus on, and I would say that probably handing over some of the operational stuff to somebody who can handle it may allow you to focus on business, and which are actually, some of these operational concerns, not in particular when transitioning employees. I mean, can you tell us a little more about that?
Well, remember that every business has core competencies, correct? So a manufacturing company knows how to manufacture the best, and they have a product that sells well. Do they really have, as an example, the full expertise to support their back office needs, whether it's payroll, HR, accounting, compliance, that kind of stuff? Now, maybe not. If you are in one country, maybe you have that expertise because you can go hire that team locally, build your own team and stuff. Think about the world today. And what is happening is the world is becoming smaller and smaller. We've known that for a long time. There are many more transactions global in today's environment. And companies are going global at a very early stage. What that does is it presents challenges of, do you understand, do you know the rules and regulations of that country, from a payroll, HR, employment law, compliance and accounting requirements. So for example, in France, you have to do monthly reporting. In Brazil, you have to do monthly reporting of income taxes, and then you have to reconcile it to what you report on an annual basis. Did you know that? If you did, great, more power to you, but most people don't, because these are intricacies of the local law. And if you don't understand that, then how do you manage through this? And those are some of the challenges companies are facing, whether it's post acquisition or just in a global expansion environment. So what is important is in an M&A transaction, the length of TSA is very important, because if you have a 0-day or 1-day TSA, you need to scale up and have all of those operations up and running. Now, PE firms are typically very hesitant to invest prior to the close of the transaction. So how do you scale up to that? Well, very hard, which is why solutions like PEO make sense, which is also why having a team of good consulting firms makes sense. And you do need more than one most times. But think about a portfolio company as you are continuing to grow. What you need is that expertise in every geography, okay? And having a global provider makes sense. Having a local provider makes sense many times, depending on the size of your operations in that country.
Mm.
The onboarding processes are different. So, for example, in many countries, in Brazil, as an example, there's a 3-step process to hire somebody. You issue them an offer letter. They have to then go through a medical check. If they pass the medical check, then you issue them the employment contract, which actually is bilingual, Portuguese and English. So think about the 3-step process. So onboarding isn't just as simple as, hey, here is an employment contract, sign here and we're done. You can show up tomorrow. Plus, you may want to do background checks, things like that. So keep things like that in mind as you are expanding or growing. And how do you manage that? And then even at various times in a company's life, you may actually have to do a reduction in force for some reason. Business is not as good. You may actually not have to do a reduction in force, but terminate somebody for non-performance. What rules apply in that situation? How do you manage that employee? How do you manage the departure of that employee? Because we have seen many, many examples over our 20-some-year history where an American company will come with the American approach. Employment is at will. I walk up to somebody and I say, hey, you're fired, you're terminated, just leave. Well, hold it. It's not that easy. It's not that simple. And then what happens is the employee sues the employer for employment practices. Now, guess what you're doing? You're going to have to go to court. You're going to have to pay a lot more money. But if you had the right expertise or relied on a specialist that can help you with these processes, it can minimize your risk, minimize the cost associated with terminating somebody or doing a RIF.
Well, it's a lot of challenges, obviously, but what I mean, and a lot of things to consider. Maybe, I mean, if I could ask you, what advice would you give to a company considering international expansion currently? You know, we talked about all these challenges, but you know, maybe, you know, some advice, you know, more of a strategic nature. What would you say?
Yeah, from a strategic perspective, you know, the most important thing is making that business argument as to why do you want to go into a particular country and what do you see in that country from a global expansion perspective. Because it does say we have a X country footprint, but does it actually make business sense or not? So building the business case, doing an analysis of what is that market size. Are you going there from a sales perspective? You need to know how much can you sell possibly in that country. Does your product actually work in that country? Will it be will it have to be localized? So selling an English language product in China may not work because so many people do not speak English. But selling in Poland might work because a lot of people in Poland speak English. Are you going to build a marketing base in that country? So we might build a center for marketing into the EU, say in Poland. Does that make sense? Is there availability of marketing talent in Poland? Now think about R&D efforts. So if you want to go into Poland to build an R&D center, well, yeah, there are a lot of educated people in Poland, and that can be successful. But are they getting educated in the right line of business that you need? So a Java programmer versus something else, maybe they don't exist in Poland. Maybe you have to go to Romania or some other place. So you got to think about that, what availability of engineering talent there is. And also the volume, because if you want to build a 5,000 person R&D center in Poland, well, that might not be possible because there aren't enough people in Poland to with that level of talent that you need to have 5,000 employees. Maybe you have to go to 3 different cities in Poland. Maybe you have to go to 3 different countries for that. Uh, Also, manufacturing, correct? So manufacturing has multiple considerations, because one of them is availability of labor. Uh, and that may depend on how automated or manual your manufacturing processes are, but that also depends on the industry, correct? So availability of labor, but more important, availability of resources. So you do not want to bring the raw materials into a country, manufacture that, and then ship it out. Maybe it makes sense to do it if the cost of labor is very low. The cost of um, the land and building that you need to build your factory is low enough that it makes sense. But then you have to think about overall, over time, what competition will do, because some other foreign government might be able to subsidize the cost of land or building or whatever and reduce the cost of manufacturing in that country where the raw materials are coming from. Guess what? It'll undermine your viability. So those are some of the things that you have to think about. And in your initial stages, just go it slow. Think about it a little, an extra day or two won't hurt, because sometimes it's very easy to go into a foreign country, very hard to pull out. So establishing in India takes anywhere from 4 weeks to 12 weeks to set up your entity and get going and everything. Pulling out of India takes anywhere from 1 to 2 years and about 2 to 3 times the cost. So yes, it is a great market, one of the second most populous country on the planet, a huge economy. Right now, they're number 5 on the in the GDP list. So yes, you may have a great opportunity there, but if your product doesn't sell because it's only in Polish, as an example, language barriers, whatever, or the electricity that is supplied in India is at 220 and in Poland it's 110. Well, you have compatibility issues with your product. How will you deal with it? You got to think about those things in advance. So do market research, understand your audience, consumers, understand your availability of resources, and how do you counter those.
Perfect. And well, one more question from my side. So, okay, I think it's a very good advice. Go it slow, do your research, do your homework, and while we do this, can we use also this time to look at, consider some specific countries that have become targets for global expansion over the past 6 months? I mean, do we have like some really interesting sort of new kids on the block in terms of targets for global expansion?
Yeah, the pandemic actually has opened up new countries, because it is actually in some respects closing some of the existing countries. So there's obviously with the COVID virus, uh, rightfully, wrongfully, China has got a lot of negative press, and what that has done is companies are now looking at alternates to China, and China has been the manufacturing bowl of the planet for now a couple of decades. So the countries that have availability of resources, both from a raw material as well as from a labor perspective, and countries that are historically not being the top contenders for manufacturing facilities are actually now rising and becoming bigger and bigger. And some of those countries are like Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, India, even developed countries like Canada are picking up because eh, as for example, US government puts restrictions on Chinese products being sold in the US. Well, if you cannot make in China and sell to the US consumer, you make it in Canada and sell to the US consumer. The largest economy on the planet, the closest country, you can do easier manufacturing, easier shipment, especially under NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. You have the ability to move goods and services across the border much more easily. Philippines, Vietnam, India, those are all countries that India has been coming up as a good manufacturing, good talent solution from an IT perspective for a long time, but they have ramped up manufacturing abilities. Similarly, Vietnam and Philippines and Thailand, where a lot of manufacturing was historically, is growing because it is a counterbalance to the China factor, especially for those companies that are worried about China for whatever the reasons might be. So these countries are very hot. And if you go to our website, globalupside.com, and type trending countries, we do have an article we had written up, and you can read that in more detail. But that's a little perspective on where you might want to go next.
Fantastic, thank you. And well, so for instance, if a Polish company considers expansion, to North America, would you then say Canada may be a better place to start than the US? Do I understand you correctly?
Well, and keep in mind the stability of the government, the laws of the country, the economic environment. A lot of those factors play into your decision, correct? So, US has historically been the lowest compliance issues, one of the easiest countries to come in and do business here. We have migrated over decades from a manufacturing country to a services country. So today, or let's just say a couple, 3 years ago, we were not considered a manufacturing hub, even though we still manufacture a lot. Right now, there is a shift in the US to onshore manufacturing. We are building more factories, we're manufacturing more goods. Yes, it is a great place to come and set up your operations. Obviously, we have our challenges with allowing foreigners to come in. And so in that respect, Canada is not a bad option because Canada is more open to innovation right now. They have a more foreigner-friendly environment, and easier to get visas and stuff and go set up an operations there, especially if in the early stages of the manufacturing, you may want to send some local nationals from Poland to set up the operations, run the operations. And we've seen this happen even in our client base, where initially people are coming from overseas to get the manufacturing facilities going, build it to the right standards, the right training, all of that. And then these individuals, want to go back and hire locals to run that operation. So those are some of the factors that you should consider wherever you may be planning to open your next facility, manufacturing facility in particular.
Well, thank you, Ragu. I mean, it's I think you told us a lot of interesting things, and maybe if I just briefly wrap it up, I mean, starting with the, what's going on currently with the current global M&A environment and things we need to bear in mind, which was really useful to learn about through the sectors that are sort of, I would say, interesting today: technology, media, telecoms, healthcare, manufacturing, and cybersecurity, e-learning, online, and then all these shifts in manufacturing, with China becoming a bit tricky. And then also, all these operational challenges that companies may need to address, and how to do this. Finally, to this sort of, go it slow, sort of do your due diligence, assess the current operations, future prospects, and then finally, this sort of interesting countries for expansion. I mean, I think it sounds really interesting. And maybe, I mean, would you like to sort of summarize a little bit from your end, because before we move to any questions and answers?
Yeah, I think you summarized it very well, Maurice. And then the thing to keep in mind is obviously think about going slow in this early phases where you're planning and stuff. But as you get to execution, once you have determined, yes, obviously speed it up, because speed to market eventually does matter. Focusing on your core competency, focusing on what you know best, whether it's manufacturing or building a technology product, whatever that might be. Focus on that. Rely on outside third parties to bring in the rest of the talent that you need. So because you cannot go it alone. You never can go it alone. So you need help. And then understanding what technologies, what industries, what sectors are hot today. How do you capitalize on it in the future? What are the prospects of the future? I mean, will healthcare slow down because we now have a vaccine? Most probably not. We have an aging population in many countries, even though some countries have a very, very young population. As this population is aging across the planet, we will continue to need more healthcare. The focus might shift from vaccine to care of the age, but doesn't mean that healthcare goes away. So thinking about that and having that vision, having that visibility in your head at least helps. With that, I think opening up for questions might make sense.
Thank you very much, Ragu. So I will start with the first question I got, and if anyone would like to ask questions, just feel free to send them in the chat. I will start with the first question, and namely, it's a question about data protection and data privacy. And one of the participants is asking, do you see any risks that sort of data protection will sort of be undermining this foreign expansion? Do you see it as a risk factor potentially?
Yeah, GDPR compliance is a risk factor for all companies. As we know, GDPR is only applicable to European countries, EU countries, or companies that are dealing with those EU citizens of those countries. So as an example, if I was just a domestic operation in the US, what do I care about? It doesn't apply to me. But what we're seeing across the world is not just the GDPR. What GDPR started across the world is that many countries are adopting similar, or in some cases, even more stringent requirements. So for example, if you go to our website, we have a GDPR privacy policy, right? But because we are we have operations in California. In fact, I am based in California. In the privacy policy, it says, if you are a California resident, please click here. It brings you up with a California supplement. Why is that important? Because we have, as an example, we set the bar when GDPR came out. We made sure we were complying with GDPR, and we are audited and certified by a Big Four for that. But as our footprint is global, we are interested in making sure that we comply the laws of every country. And countries like India, countries like Brazil are coming up with drafting their own GDPR equivalent requirements. So what we will see that countries either adopt a GDPR or some equivalent version of it. So make sure who you're dealing with those firms are GDPR compliant. If they're not, look for a different provider. because it is important, and you do not want to incur the wrath of the government in massive penalties for non-compliance.
Thank you, Ragu. I think it's yes. I mean, I would say it's increasingly sort of a compliance matter, both domestically and obviously when companies expand. I have another question from sort of a mid-sized Polish IT company asking about whether, because they seem to be at a stage where they are thinking whether to expand based on what they have, or whether to get more financing, possibly PE investment to expand more on their product.
Yeah.
I know it's hard to sort of decide, but would you give any sort of piece of advice for such business?
Yeah, you know, access to capital is very important, not just from an expansion perspective, but even from a growth perspective. And what you have to do is access to capital typically resides with either a private equity firm or a venture capitalist. Now, I'm not exactly sure about the VC environment in Poland, but you can always come to Silicon Valley, and Silicon Valley VCs are always interested in investing globally. Many of them have global offices, locations, because obviously, even though it started in Silicon Valley, it's not, innovation is not limited to this area now. It does happen in many countries, many places, and so the things to consider is what makes sense. I mean, do you have a plan? Do you have a budget for it? Do you have a story to tell to an investor as to why do you need the money? And what are you going to do with that money once you have it? That's kind of the starting point in terms of planning. Once you have that, then you need to look at who makes and which type of investor makes sense for you to attract. Because what we have seen, even in Silicon Valley, we see a lot of strategic investments. So a company like Google might invest in somebody who has a complementary technology. I think then we would have control over it. And once the product is developed, once it is successful, we may procure that company and, or at least determine the direction that company is moving into, because we are now an investor in it. So strategic investors are a good choice option, and eventually it might be a good place for an outcome, okay? Because you can actually then sell to them. A private equity firm might make sense, because if you, and a lot of private equity firms, what they're doing is they will invest in one entity and then do what's called a roll up, where they're buying a lot of players in that market, building a bigger and bigger company, and at some point then you have an exit. So if they have faith and trust in your leadership, they might invest in you, and they might grow, help you grow. Now, that does mean that they need to have faith in you, and maybe they have faith in you as a $10 million company, maybe as a $100 million company, but will they have faith in you to scale up to a $500 million, $1 billion company? And that is always open for debate. So eventually a CEO or a management team member may have to take on a different role or leave the company if that happens. The VC model is obviously a little bit different. They want to invest for 2-3 years, then they want to just make sure it goes public or sell it or something like that, and have a return of their capital and obviously benefit the current team. And so those are some of the avenues you can raise capital through. Those are some of the reasons why you would lean towards one or the other. Hopefully that helps the company. And if they want to have a more detailed discussion, Maurice, you can pass on my information to them, and I can talk to them a little bit more about it.
Absolutely, thank you, Ragu. And well, I think we are slowly moving towards the end of our the end of our meeting. And I think if anyone has any further questions, I think feel free to follow up with Ragu, whether it's through LinkedIn or you can reach out through me, through the association. Well, I mean, I would like to thank you, Ragu, so much for the meeting today. Thank you for your time and for all your explanations. Yes, Ragu has just indicated his email address, so just feel free to reach out. And thank you so much, Ragu. Thank you so much, everyone. And Ragu, if you want to say anything from you at the end, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for the audience and for the last hour. And thanks for the questions. And if there's anything we can do to help, we're here.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, and thank you for to all participants, and thank you to the Institute of Economics of the Polish Academy of Sciences, who have kindly hosted our meeting and invited the current executive MBA students as well. So thank you, everyone. I wish you, Ragu, a fantastic day, and good afternoon to everybody else in our time zone. And we hope to see you soon back again.
Thanks. Bye, guys.
Thank you. Thank you.